Hello, welcome to The Loop. Today we're going to be discussing that pivotal business consideration, cybersecurity. My name is Sheila Pancholi and I'm a technology risk partner at RSM UK. I'm joined today by my colleague Stuart Leach, who's a cyber partner in our team, and Alex Sromek, Head of Cybersecurity at SSP Group plc. Stuart and Alex, welcome to The Loop.
Thank you, Sheila. Pleasure to be here.
Thanks, Sheila. Great to be here.
So, in today's episode, we're going to be discussing the latest challenges for businesses when it comes to their cybersecurity posture. Stuart, we went out and surveyed over 400 middle market businesses earlier in the year about their cybersecurity. So maybe we can start with your thoughts on what we've learned from their responses and how the cybersecurity landscape has changed over the past few years.
I think the real standout in terms of the response that we had was around this increased level of confidence that ultimately businesses believe they have from the perspective of being able to detect and be able to prevent and withstand a cyber attack. And I think what's really interesting with that is that actually we've seen that also in other surveys. If we look at the likes of the Bank of England Systemic Risk Survey, again, sort of almost 3/4 of respondents felt confident. And it's all good to see. I think that general heightened awareness is a great thing. But I do think that there's an awful lot of risk within that level of confidence. And that really being about the assumed position that organisations are in. And what I mean by that assumed place is that where it's not validated confidence, where you're not actively testing, then that obviously, again, increases that potential risk.
Alex, what are your thoughts on this, given you're on the front line trying to safeguard your business from cyber attacks?
I'd probably question the level of confidence that's being kind of recorded. The way I translate some of this is there are probably a lot of assumptions they're making that haven't been validated and tested. I'm not saying that they don't have some good controls, but if we're talking foundational controls, the requirements or the baseline for good practice is kind of growing each year or raising each year. So I would argue that a lot of that confidence may be a little bit misplaced.
Yeah, and I think I would also just add in terms of what we've seen from the respondents is an increase in the third-party risk. And there was also a clear disconnect in how organisations viewed direct cyber attacks to how they viewed the impacts that they suffered off the back of a third-party attack. But of course, when you're looking at a threat landscape, that holistic picture absolutely needs to include the third-party piece as well.
And that's an interesting point, isn't it, Stuart? I mean, we've seen a significant increase in cyber attacks across the supply chain. I think it would be good to understand a little bit more about why are the cyber criminals targeting third parties now?
It ultimately comes down to value. I think when you look at why certain organisations are targeted, it's the aggregate. It's an attacker positioning themselves to target one organisation, expelling the effort into that ultimately for the gain of the customer base that particular third party is serving. And that is obviously ultimately the piece that's really attractive to an attacker. Of course, again, you also have that position where the customers of those third parties are perhaps actually not implementing the right level of security based on the services that are actually being provided. So it does create a potential weak link in that as well.
I think that's a really good point. The organisations that are kind of typically targeted are your kind of cloud service providers. In the US, you've got healthcare companies, insurance companies, where the data is absolutely critical and they can make the most money out of that information, whether through extortion, ransomware, etc. I think the challenges that companies face is they often don't understand how reliant they are on suppliers. They don't accurately map out their supplier base as well. So I think there's a lot of blind spots in their supply chain that they just don't understand or recognise. I think mapping those out is probably one aspect of where organisations need to improve.
One thing we do know is obviously the legislative environment across a number of industry sectors is becoming extremely complex. And how is that mapping across from a cybersecurity perspective?
From my perspective, and I'm by no means an expert, there's a lot of effort going into, particularly in the EU, around raising kind of the bar for security practices. That's what I see as a thematic point coming out of a lot of the legislation and a lot of the kind of the work that's going into these areas.
Yeah, no, I completely agree. I think the challenge is there isn't a global piece of legislation that talks about cyber. And that also creates that challenge around some of the cyber threats and countries around the world dealing with cyber in a very different way. And without that sort of global view, it then comes down to each jurisdiction implementing their own legislations. We see a lot coming from the EU at the moment, from a directive standpoint. NIS2 as an example of that, DORA in across financial services across the EU. And all of those things are going to be helpful, but they're still relatively industry focused. And that creates a problem, because when you look across the economy, it's not just certain sectors, it's all sectors coming together that are ultimately going to drive that. And a breach in one can have a detrimental impact across multiple. Certainly global organisations face a real challenge in understanding that complexity, and also actually what they come in scope of to start with. So again, it is a really complex place.
And do we think that the board level awareness of cyber risk has increased as fast as sort of the threat landscape and also the changing legislation?
Cybersecurity absolutely has to align to business strategy, and the board obviously are responsible for the governance and the controls applied across the business. So I think there's more that can be done. I do think it's improving. I think one thing that would always be nice to see at a board level is actual support advisory services or trusted advisors at the board that are actually imparting cyber knowledge. But at the same time, there is still many boards out there that, going back to the point around confidence, there's been a financial investment. The board have been told there's an investment, so everyone's in good shape, which clearly is not always the case. Otherwise, we'd see decrease in cybercrime as opposed to the increases that we see.
It almost seems to me as if there needs to be somebody at the board level who's got a really good handle on the technology landscape and how things are changing and what that means in terms of the risk profile of the business as well, which, I think we're all aware is not always the case, that there isn't always a board level sponsor who's got a really deep understanding of technology. What are your thoughts on that?
I think we're getting into the realms of should a CISO be technical or not. And I think they absolutely should. I think there's a degree of technical experience that they need. But I think more importantly, there's a requirement for that particular role or person to be able to translate and articulate a lot of these regulations, legislation, technical challenges into what it means for that particular company or what they need to worry about. I think all the board will want to know is, we've seen all this bad stuff happening. Are we okay? We spend X amount. Are we okay? And it's having to navigate that, and the messaging, I think, is really important.
I think there's two areas that needs to be considered. I think the CISO or security representative talking to the board needs to be able to talk more along the lines of the board's language. Equally, the board also should have a responsibility to also try and understand what it is they're being told. We do often see, board reports that contain a load of technical data, and nobody's going to read and understand that. So it is ultimately trying to distill what you're seeing from a cyber position, be it controls, be it value on investment, be it are we exposed to the latest threat. That information needs to be distilled and actually articulated in plain language as much as it can be.
Stuart, you mentioned changing legislation. I think you made specific reference to DORA in the financial services sector coming into force. We've got NIS2 for critical national infrastructure. We've also got the EU AI Act emerging next month too. Now, artificial intelligence, Gen AI, very, very interesting area. Again, a huge sort of rapid shift in technology and technology evolution. What is that going to mean from a cybersecurity perspective? Maybe coming to you first, Alex, given you're sort of on the operational side of cyber, is this now just going to add even more complexity?
So I think AI has not necessarily increased the level of complexity of attacks that we see. I think it's the scale and volume. I think it's enabled a lot of automation and efficiency in what attackers are doing. There's nothing specific that I can kind of point to in my experience in the last few years. I would argue that it's not a huge problem for us right now. Obviously, I don't want to jinx what we're doing or any kind of attacks that may come out of the back of that. But I think there are some recent examples where AI has been used. It's caused a lot of damage. So there's a recent deepfake incident that resulted in, the transfer of funds, the amount of, I think it was $25 million. But again, part of me does think there is what level of process or controls are in place. But if someone jumped on a deepfake video, it's, can you transfer me some money? Yeah, okay. Click a button and off it goes. Yeah, there obviously needs to be some process and controls in place to prevent that. I'd argue it's just the scale of the existing attacks, like phishing, email compromise attacks, things like that will ramp up over time.
I agree. I think the scale and sophistication that you're going to see and the level of automation is going to increase with the use of AI from a cyber threat standpoint. And certainly also when you look at, there are malicious LLMs out there that cyber criminals are ultimately using. That almost drives them to be ahead of where most businesses are. I think when you look at the use of AI, the use case for AI from a cyber threat standpoint, it's not too dissimilar to what businesses would look at from a use case. It's efficiency, it's augmentation, it's ultimately driving a capability at scale and taking away the sort of drudgery of the tasks that attackers would have to go through. And that being, through things like coding, for example, scripting. There's AI that can do that. Looking at circumvention of know your customer, for example, where we talk about impersonation, deepfake, where you've got business models that are predicated on speed of being able to spin up accounts. If you think about bank accounts, for example, being able to put in an application and be live with an account within a couple of minutes. All of that's automated and it's reliant on things like the multi-factor. It's reliant on voice, it's reliant on video. So, if you can break that model, then you're going to be very successful. So an awful lot of things I think will continue to evolve off the back of AI, but ultimately attackers are not going to change what works.
I feel like we've almost come full circle back to the beginning of where we started with sort of the level of confidence and, this sort of almost assumed confidence. I think if we go back to sort of our middle market business arena, do you think there's enough understanding and awareness of the potential threats of AI because it's very transformative?
I would say probably not. Organisations are driving at speed to try and adopt and use AI. It's here to stay. So, it's a marathon, not a sprint. I do understand that businesses, in some respects, need to be first to market, but it's really understanding the use case and the benefit that you're going to get from AI before you run at speed with it and taking time to develop those use cases, understand the potential exposure that you're going to have from that, from privacy implications, from the use of models that perhaps you don't control. And organisations absolutely need to understand that and implement the right guardrails around it to try and get a level of control.
Just going back to the point around the malicious side of things. So again, the malicious LLMs as an example. I think it's Fraud GPT, Wolf GPT as an example. These are paid for platforms. So it benefits the developers and whoever owns and maintains these malicious platforms to improve them. So arguably the businesses need to be aware of the threats of AI, but not necessarily just be mindful that don't just jump straight in and, right, we've got a subscription to the various chat GPT or LLMs out there. And I think before you know it, you'll end up with a sprawling estate of AI plugins into various different tools and holes everywhere.
Alex, what are your thoughts on maybe having an AI strategy, so really sort of formalising, how you're going to adopt and utilise AI?
I think they need an agreement, probably at exec level, to say, right, are we even going to bother with AI? That's not to write it off completely, but I think a lot of organisations see this huge boom of activity around AI when ChatGPT came along. And it was, we've got to start and use it. It can help reduce costs, efficiency. But really, when they look at it, I don't think there's a valid use case for a lot of businesses, other than it's the nice new shiny thing that they've got to jump on.
So it's fair to say we've got obviously a very fast moving technology landscape. We've got a lot of new emerging technologies coming on board. Obviously, we've got the complexity of the legislative landscape also changing. If you had one or two takeaways for business leaders in the middle market, how are they going to navigate all of this? What would your advice be?
I think my advice would be we go back to the beginning. I think the point around the confidence that worried me slightly. It's we there's if it was, I think this stat was 90% were confident, and I don't know quite how that translates to effectiveness of controls. My advice would be to test a lot of the assumptions that they've got, get the foundational elements in place, know your assets, good access control, good account hygiene, and then if you find gaps, translate that into risk, and that's what will drive focused investment.
I wish I'd gone first. So I think certainly thinking about the foundations is absolutely crucial. I think the other thing is the cyber footprint. That really needs to be understood. Organizations don't operate in silos anymore. You can't wrap a nice boundary around your data. There is an ever-increasing position on the use of third parties, use of technologies more widely, and without understanding that, you can't understand the holistic nature of your threat landscape. So that definitely needs to be a key area of focus.
Alex, Stuart, fascinating discussion. Thank you so much for sharing your insights and joining us on The Loop today. For more information on cybersecurity, please visit RSM UK's website and do follow us on The Loop for more insight into today's current business challenges.